Okay, so these are basically going to be the best budget decks for you guys to climb with. For those of you who want to try out some new decks for the new expansion, but don't really have the money or the dust to craft one of the really expensive, let's say Highlander Priest decks that take anywhere from 8 to 10 legendaries. So if you don't want to break the bank, but you still want to climb and have some fun with the new expansion, these are the decks for you. And the first one is Pure Aggro Demon Hunter. Now, on this list, most of these decks will actually be aggro and or mid-range because the control decks are just by nature more expensive. So bear with me, but I'll try to put in at least 1 or 2 budget control decks so that way you guys can have some fun. But anyway, Pure Aggro Demon Hunter is basically just that. You just go pure face, pure aggro, you ram them down, and you'll probably win. You have good card draw with things like Acrobatics, as well as the, Stilt Stepper, which allows you to draw a card and gain 4 attack. This allows you to draw anywhere from 2 to 4 cards on its own, not to mention the fact that you also have Voracious Reader if you dump your hand earlier and you're able to play her. Overall, generally what you want to do is you want to hard mulligan for as many 1-drop minions as you can. Demon Companion does count as a minion, by the way. And then if you have 1 or 2 1-drops already, you can then keep some of these 2-drops, but I would almost never keep a 3-drop because I'd rather just dump minions than curve out, right? And that's the difference between aggro and tempo. Tempo is you want to play the highest cost thing you can every single turn for the most value. Aggro is you want to get as many things as you can out as quickly as possible. So in my opinion, it's better to play a 1-drop and a 2-drop on turn 3 than perhaps a Dreadlord's Bite. Although there are situations where Dreadlord's Bite will be good because it's able to do 1 damage to all enemies, so into another aggro deck it could be good. But for the most part, go for mostly 1 cost with a couple of 2 costs in your opening hand. Go almost entirely face, but if you don't want to go face in a particular situation, hit with your face. Because if you hit with your face, then you get to keep your minions on the board and keep applying pressure, which is just better in my opinion. And your health doesn't matter, because if you're getting outrushed down, you're probably going to lose anyway. And that's basically it for deck number 1, and let's jump into the next one. So this next deck list does cost about 5,000 dust, but hear me out, okay? It really only requires the 2 legendaries, Zephyrus and Dino Tamer Bran, and the rest are all commons and rares for the most part. I took out every single epic, including Snake Trap, which, I mean, is a classic card, and you could argue people should have at this point, but obviously newer players aren't going to have a card like Snake Trap because it's a very niche card just in general anyway. So I ended up making this deck, and if you look at the curve, it's still a very aggressive deck. It doesn't have Polkelt or Bran or the Rifle, which is a little bit rough for the deck because they were really big power spike turns, but you still have Bone Wraith, you now have Bone Wraith, which I think is just a very powerful card in general. Especially for an aggro deck, this protects your other aggro minions and is basically 2 minions because it has the Reborn. Hyena Alpha just combos really well with the secrets in general. I threw in a Beaming Sidekick to help for the early game a little bit. And yeah, those are the cards I basically put in to make the deck better. Or not better, but more budget. And overall, this deck, if the old Highlander deck was able to do, was able to go 5-0 really quick, I think that this deck will definitely be strong as well, because of the fact that you still have that late game closeout with Bran and Zephyrus, which were your main win conditions anyway. You'll draw them a little less consistently without Polkelt, obviously, but I think that the deck is still strong enough to win a lot of games just on its own. So I think this deck is going to be very powerful. The fully made version of this deck is the 3rd highest win rate deck in the game all around, and I think that this deck will still be perfectly fine. You have some decent draw as well with Voracious Reader, Scavenger's Ingenuity. You can thin out the deck with Phase Stalker. And overall, it's a very powerful deck. So, yeah, that's it for this deck. Let's move on to the next one. So it was either this deck or Libram Paladin, because both could be run on a pretty moderate budget, but the simple fact is Libram Paladin really needs Lady Liadrin, which this deck needs as well, but it also needs Yogg-Saron as your late game and Lord Barov as one of your main forms of removal, because you're more of a control deck than a tempo deck, and this one was just a lot easier to make budget. So basically I took out Yril because this card is just too expensive for what it does, honestly. It's good to have, but not necessary. I took out McGurgle, which that one did actually hurt a little bit, and I took out the High Abyss. To be fair, the High Abyss could sometimes low roll and feel kind of bad to get, so I didn't feel as bad removing her from the deck. So then what I ended up doing was I replaced it with some extra early game with 2 Bronze Explorers and a Blessing of Kings, so you could have some extra turn 4 plays, as well as a more consistent turn 3, because if you look here, you really only have 2 turn 3s other than Bronze Explorer, and it's the Goody 2 Shields. Helps into aggro decks a little bit, which is in fact pretty nice. And overall, I think the deck is still going to run the exact same, which is play some minions, make them really tall, try to end the game as quickly as possible with pumps and big minions, and then if you can't, play Lady Liadrin to get it back, or get the board back if you're able to like get to that late game. Overall, this deck costs, again, a little under 5,000 dust. I think it's quite strong. I think it was about 4,720 dust. Don't quote me on that, though. I closed the Hearthstone deck tracker. I apologize, but it was definitely less than 5,000, which is pretty decent in my opinion. So hopefully you guys enjoy this deck, and let's jump into the next one. So the next deck list is Soul Demon Hunter, and the reason why it's a little bit later is because I was contemplating whether or not I wanted to have 2 Demon Hunter decks on this list, but honestly, they're both really strong. This deck is less aggro based and more just like burst based. And I took out Sociologist, which some decks don't actually even run, by the way. And I took out Il'gynoth. Il'gynoth is a little bit more of a higher priority to put into this deck, in my opinion, but they're both not absolutely needed, because Kane's Sun Fury being able to ignore taunts is usually enough to kill off the opponent anyway, not to mention the fact you have Consume Magic, which gets rid of taunts from the opponent, and still the new Bladed Lady card, which allows you to potentially kill off a sticky taunt minion and push for more damage just for 1 mana. So the deck still runs almost exactly the same. It's going to be ridiculously powerful, just as most Soul Demon Hunters are, and this won't be quite as strong as the fully made version, but it'll still be great. I think it's probably a top 3 deck in the game in its full form, and in its budget form, it's definitely still a force to be reckoned with. It's less than 4,000 dust as well, and it's very effective. It's budget, it's effective, it's pretty straightforward, so it's not that hard to learn either. It's a little bit more difficult than aggro, because you do have to know when to trade with your minions and when not to. You almost never trade with your face, but if there are minions on the board, you do occasionally trade with your minions, or kill off your own minions with Shard Shatter Mystic to gain board control. So you have to figure out that a little bit, because there are a couple of things you have to think about with this deck, but it's still very simple, very cost efficient, and I would recommend it for anybody. One other thing, if you don't want to run Consume Magic or any of these other cards, one great card that you could put in to replace them is actually the Spectral Sight or the Sightless Watcher for a little bit of extra tempo early game or some extra draw. They're both very good options as well. So let's jump into the next one. So this deck normally has 2 legendaries, Inara and Instructor Fireheart, but they're not really needed. They only add like a little bit of late game reach to your deck, where you're able to potentially you know, get a couple of spells or push a little bit of extra damage with Wind Fury and some attack. So they are helpful, but I took them out and put in 1 more Novice Engineer and put in 1 more Loot Hoarder to be a little bit more consistent in terms of drawing the Knuckles and re-equipping the Knuckles. And the deck still runs pretty much exactly the same. You want to put deck or minions on the board that do some pretty cool things that either generate extra stuff or aren't very mana efficient stat-wise, but have a really good ability, like the Novice Engineer, and then boom, you drop Knuckles, you hit with the Knuckles, you pump your board, you evolve them, and you'll probably win the game. The deck still runs exactly the same as it would before, except it doesn't have as good of a late game, but that like 9 times out of 10 won't matter. So this deck is going to be still very, very strong. It's very cheap. It's about 3,700 dust, which is, I mean, it's very cheap. And it is a little bit more expensive because you do need the Bogspine Knuckles, even though it's a bit expensive and it is an epic, it is a very much needed card in the deck. It's literally how you win the game. And Farsight, technically you could do without. I just really like Farsight because if you're able to make one of these cards cheaper, then you're able to combo with the Knuckles a lot easier on a future turn. Like let's say you use Farsight and draw the Knuckles, or you draw Loot Hoarder. Then you're able to drop Loot Hoarder after your Knuckles dies for 1 mana, and it allows you to play more things as well. So yeah, it's definitely still a very cheap deck. It runs the exact same way. It's going to be strong regardless, and it's a great deck to climb with. So at about 4,500 dust roughly, Big Druid is the next deck on this list. Now let me just say real quick, if you have the dust to make Yasharge, okay, if you have the dust to make the Yasharge card that puts Carnival Clown and the Strongman back in your hand, I would highly recommend trying to put him in, okay, because he is the only legendary this deck really needs, and he basically solidifies your late game, because if they deal with not one but both of your Carnival Clowns, you can kind of be a sitting duck. So yes, this legendary is really, really important, but you don't need it because usually the Carnival Clown play for a full board of 8/8 taunts is usually enough to beat a lot of decks anyway. Not even that, but you also have the Cenarian Ward and a couple of other big minions that can be quite powerful. Without Yasharj, the deck is a decent amount weaker, but especially into in lower ranks where people don't have fully optimized decks or some of the best removal, you can probably get away without playing Yasharj. The deck just has consistent ramp, good draw, and you're able to get to the end game with Carnival Clown and Yasharj relatively consistently. I will say, if you want to put Yasharj back in, the card that I would take out is probably one of these Wraths or a Rising Wind, simply because they were the cards that I put in for the Yasharj. And then also Yogg-Saron's pretty good, so if I were to put in both of these legendaries for a more solidified late game, I'd probably just take out 2 Wraths or 1 Wrath and 1 Rising Wind, and basically just go with that. So that's basically my advice on this deck. It's a very strong deck still, and I would recommend you play it. Okay, so this deck is about 2600 dust, and honestly, it's just another aggro deck. It's Stealth Aggro Rogue. The legendaries that I took out of this deck that I used to run were Infiltrator Lillian and Edwin Van Cleef. I do think that they're very good cards, and I put in a Beaming Sidekick and a Deadly Poison to replace them, but I think that the replacement cards are pretty solid as well. Beaming Sidekick allows you to pump up a stealth minion, so that way it can't, like, if the opponent has some sort of cheap board wipe, say Fan of Knives, obviously people don't run that, but something more like a just a ping, obviously, from a mage, or just a 1 damage hit from Druid or Rogue or any number of cards. It just makes it so that it won't die to that, and other small minions can't trade into it. So I like the Beaming Sidekick play. I think it synergizes very well with the deck, and the Deadly Poison just gives you a little bit of extra damage to push for lethal, and overall I think the deck ends up being pretty solid. The old version of this deck that was pure aggro ended up being like, 5-2. It's a very small sample size, but the expansion just started. Old Stealth Rogue was also extremely powerful, and Edwin I very rarely used anyway. He did end up popping off sometimes early game, especially if I got the Foxy Fraud, but like 8 times out of 10, he was at most a 6/6, and he wasn't usually played until turn 4 or 5 after I'd already played a lot of my aggressive options, so it was never really like insane. And then Infiltrator Lillian was a good card, but again, for a legendary, probably wasn't necessary. So overall, I think that this deck is quite strong. I think it covers a couple of the weaknesses that the other deck didn't, which is making these stealth minions a little bit more durable with Beaming Sidekick, and it pushes a little bit more damage with the Deadly Poison, which is not too shabby. So overall, I think that this deck is quite solid. I'm sorry I didn't have that many like slower decks on this list. It's just they're so hard to craft or so hard to make budget. I mean, if you think about it, look at Ticketus Warlock, right? And Ticketus Warlock doesn't look like it would be that expensive, but considering the fact Twisting Nether is a legendary you kind of need, you also need Dark Skies. Philosophy super important as an epic, along with Cascading Dishester and Void Drinker. They're all epic cards. Highlander Priest, dear God, it literally has like 10 legendaries. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It literally has 10 legendaries. Then we have N'Zoth Warrior, again, a large number of legendaries and several epics. It's just so much harder to make control decks budget, and I tried my best, but I couldn't do it. I'm sorry, guys. And I hope you guys still enjoyed the deck list. I hope you guys have a fun time climbing with these more budget decks, and I will hope to see you in the next video. Bye.